Michael, tell us a story about Jimmy Rowles.
Well, of course, Jimmy was followed very closely by all the other jazz piano players in New York and elsewhere too, of course, partly because he had something that was so much his own, and there was something really sly, understated, and shadowy, especially about his changes, as they call them, or his harmonic sense. I mean, it was all melody with Jimmy, really, but he used to carry a briefcase, and like a lot of piano players do. But like I said, a lot of his work in New York at that time was solo and duo, and of course he was also with Ella Fitzgerald at the time, but that was mostly touring. Anyway, he would carry this briefcase with a notebook in it, a binder, and all the piano players thought, oh, that's all his stuff, written out, his whole thing, the harmonic thing, the chord changes. But what was in there, it was nothing but 8.5 by 11 sheets of typing paper with song lyrics written out just in blocks of, print, like poetry, no music at all. Because Jimmy had always sung, and he loved all the great singers. And of course, again, a lot of his career was spent with the great singers. Not only Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday, also Sarah Vaughan. He was the pianist on Robert Mitchum Sings Calypso. He was good friends with Mitchum, and he had great anecdotes about a lot of the Hollywood people that he knew, including Henry Mancini. He was a top call for Mancini, and he said that he felt that Mancini was really one of the most masterful musicians he'd ever met. And this is from a guy who met both Duke Ellington and Stravinsky. But he put Mancini way up there. He said he absolutely brilliant musician, and he was a top call with Mancini. So, Jimmy made some money. He's also, believe it or not, he's the pianist on Up, Up and Away in My Beautiful Balloon by The Fifth Dimension. You can really hear him even down in the low left hand doing these trademark rumbly things in the bass hand that he did. He was the only one who did that, I think. So, a recording artist of Jimmy's level of demand would get all kinds of interesting stuff going on in the studio. And that's one of the reasons why he had stayed in LA for so long before coming out here. He lived here for 8 years in New York and went back eventually to LA. But while he was here, he also was not too shy about exposing his ability as an artist. He was an avid amateur cartoonist, kind of a Thurber-esque style. I don't think that's wrong. And everybody that knew him always got a drawing sooner or later. And just to remember one drawing that I loved, he was as I said, he was very beloved by all the piano players. Including Tommy Flanagan. They were very close friends, and they loved each other, and they socialized together quite often. And on one of those times, and I was there as a matter of fact, Jimmy had his pad and his pen, and he drew this wonderful, pretty large drawing of two Steinways, nose to nose, so the keyboards are at opposite ends. And he's standing at one keyboard, and Tommy Flanagan is standing at the other keyboard. And they each have a bow and arrow with, cocked back, ready to shoot at each other. But instead of being tipped with a point, they're tipped with Valentine hearts. And I hope Diana or whoever has Tommy Flanagan's effects must still have that drawing, because it was so touching and funny and just priceless. But his drawing, he was a soul man, and his soul got into everything he touched, or did, really. He was one of those people. And, we've all known people like that, not necessarily having anything whatsoever to do with music or anything like it, but everything he did was infused with this flavor of himself in a delightful way. He was a magnet for people, especially women, would just sit right down on the piano bench with him and give him a kiss, young, old. Oh, I remember one hilarious night when it had snowed like the blizzard of 1888 in the Village. I mean, there were witnesses. People were skiing on University Place, right down the middle of the street. The snow was so heavy. And nobody was out at night. But we made it. We intrepidly came all the way to the Knickerbocker on University Place to hear Jimmy, probably with Michael Moore, I believe. And the only other person in the place was Phyllis Diller, with her chauffeur. Her limo was parked outside. They were good friends from California days. And of course, Phyllis Dillard was actually a fairly accomplished player on piano. And I mean, she insisted that we join her at her table. And we just had the most raucous, hilarious night of joy because her spirit was crazy funny and positive. And of course, she was just absolutely in love with Jimmy, both as a man and as an artist. It was just one of those things that would happen a lot in New York, and certainly not just to me, to everybody we knew. These kind of things would happen, but Jimmy there was always something going on when Jimmy was around like that, and of course I have to say that when Jimmy Rowles introduced you to some serious face card musician, it counted for a lot. I mean, that was a great introduction. Suddenly some famous person that was a great musician would look at you like, oh, Jimmy Rowles says you're great? I never heard of you, but maybe you're something, And this happened to me, fortunately, with Benny Carter. And I had actually had the nerve to walk up and say hello to Benny Carter when I was a kid, hearing him at Michael's Pub, where his rhythm section was Ray Bryant, George Duvivier, and Grady Tate. And that was another thing about New York in those days. The visiting horn players, the rhythm sections that they picked up were guys like that, or Jimmy Cobb, or Billy Higgins, or they were the trios or duos that backed up the visiting horn stars and so on, were superstars themselves. But yeah, Jimmy introduced me to Benny Carter in a more intimate setting where we had a chance to chat for a minute, and I had the lovely opportunity to record with Jimmy Rowles. I was a side musician on the Stash label, and at that time that was an independent label, and the producer was the owner of the label, and he really went by his own taste. And he said, after a couple of dates as a sideman, he said, we're gonna give you a date as a leader. I said, okay, great. I mean, that's usually the way it happens. And I asked Jimmy if he would like to record with me, and he said yes. And I asked him who he wanted on bass, and he said Michael Moore, because he'd been working with Michael a lot. So that was obviously fine with me. I knew Michael Moore already. But I was nervous about the drum thing, because I did not want to record without drums. And I knew that Jimmy did not really like drums much at that point in his development. I know it sounds funny, but Jimmy, again, it was a real education. He taught me a lot of things about, for instance, he made those 2 records with Ray Brown during the time that I knew him on Concord. And we loved those records. But, Jimmy would say, well, yeah, but there's only one way you can play with Ray Brown. That's Ray Brown's way, of course. And I never stopped to think about that kind of thing. I'm a journeyman. I'm green. What do I know? To me, Ray Brown is a genius. But Jimmy wasn't saying he wasn't a genius. But what he is saying is something that I didn't think about, which is that when you record with a musician who A, is an extremely powerful musician, and B, has a very powerful personality, that might not be really that much about you anymore, or puts you in a certain direction where you don't want to be all the time. So I was nervous about the drums because he didn't like any, but the only drummer he mentioned at that time that he liked was Donald Bailey, who was living in Tokyo, so that wasn't too practical. Other than that, I'd never heard him say anything about drummers except how he didn't like to play with them. So I asked Michael Moore for some advice. I said, I can't call the drummers I'm using at the time because they were kind of a bit oriented toward like Sidney Catlett or Kenny Clark, and I knew that wasn't where Jimmy was at that time. Well, Michael recommended Joey Barron, which turned out to be an interesting choice. Joey played wonderfully on it. His sound was not the drum sound that I really preferred in terms of his timbres, certainly at that time. But I think it was a very successful date. And we recorded When Lights Are Low, which of course was written by Benny Carter, both music and lyrics. So at a gig where Benny Carter was playing and Jimmy and I were in the audience, Jimmy had told me, no, bring him a copy of the LP and give it to him. I mean, you recorded his tune. After all, he's getting mechanicals on this thing, so he wants to add it for himself. So I gave him a copy of the record, and then I saw him. Benny Carter was coming to New York at least 3-4 times a year for something, either to play clubs or some fantastic shows at Lincoln Center. But that's another reminiscence. Anyway, so I gave him a copy of the record, and he genuinely liked it, to the point where the next time I saw him, about 3 months later, he was playing at Sweet Basil. Again, it was Kenny Barron this time, and George Duvivier, and a wonderful drummer. His name will come back to me in a minute. Oh dear, I'm terrible. But Mousy Alexander. Mousy Alexander was on drums, and it's Sweet Basil. So I went down to hear him the opening night, which was Tuesday. And he said, "Oh, Michael, I'm so glad to see you again. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your record." And then he looks me dead in the eye and with full heart says, "Thank you for recording my song." I mean, as if it had been his first time out. Or as if I was anybody that was going to do something for his song that had been recorded by every known musician. But that was the kind of man he was. He would have made a fantastic president of the United States, or president of the UN, or whatever. He was a man ascended on the highest level in every way, both in his manners, in his intellect, in his heart, and his honesty, and very impressive human being. And certainly I'm not the only person, but probably everyone I think who ever met him said that. Even when he was a teenager, I heard and read that he was already a personage of great respect here near the neighborhood where we are in San Juan Hill. In his youth, people would come to him as an authority because he was straight and he knew. And he was just a very heavy influence in my life. Everything he said, whether it pertained to music or not, spoke of great experience, tremendous and difficult self-examination, if you know what I mean. He was that kind of person. He had done the hard work that it takes to ascend like that. You don't just get handed that, I don't think. This was a lifetime of struggle, discipline, almost superhuman energy. Like Ellington, Armstrong, these men had energy because so much of what they had to do was against something. And of course, I'm talking about their race and the way the rest of the world reacted to it, which, shall we say, in America was far from positive. So in addition to what is often a difficult way to go as a musician in any society, they had this additional kind of almost tidal wave against them, which again leads me to the phrase almost superhuman energy and ability to just keep standing up against a world that in many ways wanted to knock you down pretty seriously. But you could read that in him, in Benny Carter, and there was no bitterness, no discernible bitterness, which to me made it even more remarkable. He did not wear it on his shoulder. And also he had the trappings of American success, and that was important to him, and he'd earned it the hard way. A couple of Rolls Royces, mansion in Beverly Hills, 4 wives. At that time in America, that was expensive. There was not much equitability in divorce court. He paid for those women, and that was the way it was at the time. So, but he had earned that from something real. And he comported himself not like a famous star, but like a man of inestimable value in a quiet way. But he was real dynamic on stage, played fabulously always. And when I saw him this time I'm alluding to at Sweet Basil, after he had heard my record and said a nice thing about it, he said to me, "What are you doing Saturday night?" I said, "Well, I got nothing to do." He said, "Would you like to come back and play with me?" I said, "You mean here at Sweet Basil?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Yes, I would like to do that, Mr. Carter." To top it off, I have to say, that day, April 9th, was my birthday. That Saturday. So I went, and I figured I'd play a tune, But I played a whole set with Benny Carter and Kenny Barron and Mousy and Duvivier. And he let me record it onto a cassette, and I have a couple of Polaroid pictures of that day, that night at Sweet Basil. And you can tell by the sound of my voice that I still get excited when I think about that. And yes, I've played with a lot of face cards, as I call them, before and since then. Not always from the jazz world, from many interesting worlds of art, literature, and music. And I've treasured and loved every experience, even the bad ones, which there were hardly any, if any. But that experience with Benny Carter was very exciting for me. And I'm certainly not the only one. I know he recorded with my friend Scott Hamilton on Concord, and my friend John Gordon, who's also a wonderful saxophone player. And there were other musicians and saxophone players around that were mentored by Benny Carter. And I'm just, to this day, I can't believe in a way that I was one of them, because like all those people, I knew his work from record and thought of him in the same light as I think of Mahler or Charlie Parker or Louis Armstrong. So for me, that was some pretty heady stuff. And I certainly owe Jimmy one for that, and Benny Carter too. And we stayed in touch for a long time after that, and I was always there whenever he did anything in New York. Again, like I said, which during that time, up into the 90s, was often. I was fortunate he was still playing trumpet in the early 80s, as well as alto. He had given up clarinet, which he was a marvelous clarinet player. But anyway, I have a lot of great feelings and memories of Benny Carter. I also knew his two amanuensi, is that the word? Ed Berger and Ed Berger Jr., who were also very sweet to me, gave me a copy of the book, the 2-volume book they did on Benny Carter. And it was just something that people like that were around and accessible. And there's a much, much longer list. I could go on for far too long about how many other people of Benny Carter's stature and time were accessible and even hired you for gigs, or you wound up on gigs with them.
Well, we'll get to that, I promise you, and I promise the audience.